It's midterm season. That means it's, I'm making videos about what I'm supposed to be studying to avoid actually studying season. So I've made videos before that have touched on the idea that higher oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere previously, like way back in history, allowed for insects to have much increased body sizes to what they are today. I've also touched on how that does not work for vertebrates, because that's not at all how vertebrate physiology works, so no, giants didn't exist back then because of the higher oxygen concentrations, but we're not talking about that. So there is a direct correlation between the higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere and insect size of their bodies. But there's also a very interesting chronological correlation between the elevated oxygen in the atmosphere and the evolution of insect flight. So powered flight, which is the mechanism of actually like flying as opposed to just gliding, is very energetically expensive, and in the case of insect evolution, early flight mechanics would be like ridiculously inefficient. So insect physiology right now works because they're very small and light, and they have pretty well adapted flight mechanisms and like muscles and physiology and all that. They're very good at flying. Well, most of them. However, early insect ancestors did not have those very well adapted flight mechanisms, and so any flight would just be very energetically expensive and very inefficient and not worth it. Because the wings would not be very well developed. They'd be like, okay, this is kind of wrong phrasing, but it's the best way I can. They're like in the process of evolving, even though that's not how evolution works. That's just kind of the best way I can phrase it right now. But they are not the same as they are in modern insect, so logically, powered flight wouldn't have evolved just because it was so inefficient. Like, if we had most ancestral insects evolving currently, so how they were however many million years ago, how they are now, they would not probably be able to evolve flight just because the oxygen concentrations are so low right now as compared to back then. But since the oxygen concentrations were very high back then, it made metabolism easier, it made everything just way more efficient, and so it didn't use nearly as much energy to do powered flight back then with the high oxygen concentrations as it would now with those same ancestral insects, if that makes sense. So now, if insects had to re-evolve flight due to like cost benefit, it probably wouldn't happen just because it would cost way more energy than there would be a benefit of the flight. However, back then, it cost way less energy just because everything was easier with metabolism and all that due to the increased oxygen elevation, because they have a much different respiratory, circulatory, etc. system than us vertebrates do. And so they were much easier able to benefit from the higher oxygen concentrations and could do some pretty neat stuff with it, such as evolving powered flight. So there were way more benefits as opposed to costs when evolving powered flight way back then due to the higher oxygen, which I think is neat.